the next set of slides has to do with Etienne Gilson's notion of the philosophical order as kind of modified by myself. And what is the significance of this? Well, the idea is that the different branches of philosophy do appear in a specific order, right? First, there is metaphysics, the discussion of existence, what things there are, what is the nature of being. Second, there is epistemology, which, George was just touching on, the theory of knowledge. How do we know what we know? Third, ethics, which is a code of conduct for our lives and how we treat each other. Finally, politics, which we seem to have jumped on in the first 3 slides, which is the practical application of ethics. We ask, is this a rigid hierarchy? Is it a strict hierarchy? And whether it's actually possible, as we've just done actually, to discuss the ethics, for example, without having first discussed the metaphysics and the epistemology. The next slide is, we're just going to give an example of the sort of thing we mean, but I think Ronen will have something to say first about this, if it's the right order or not, that kind of thing. Ronen.
I have no problem with that order, and whether you're an idealist or a realist, I think for the most part, the order would be acceptable. Metaphysics is always the starting point for knowledge. You can't really decide what knowledge is unless you have an idea of what the nature of reality is. So you need to have some understanding of that. Plato's notion of reality is that it's 2 things, a world of forms and a world of matter. And his epistemology is going to be based on that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And his ethics is going to be based on that. In some ways, Aristotle is the same. His understanding is that reality is made up of 2 things, form and matter. However, the way that matter and form interact is different. It's going to lead him to a somewhat different epistemology and possibly ethics, which it does. It leads him in a different direction.
Yeah.
But yeah, the order is good. I totally agree with that, John.
So the next slide is an example that we sort of come up with together. For example, suppose your metaphysics is that you believe in God, that there's a supernatural deity in some sense, right? Well, the epistemology, then, your method of gaining knowledge is divine revelation. You just read the Bible, and off you go. Ethics, again, that's not a problem. You just obey the 10 Commandments or or whatever similar things there are in other religions. In politics, the logical solution is the theocracy. So I put that forward just as an example of how it is that the metaphysics epistemology kind of leads to the ethics and the politics in that sense, and why it's important, I guess, ultimately, whether you do start as an idealist, therefore, or as a realist. But we go on to the next slide now, which is interesting, because which is about St. Thomas Aquinas. I mean, just the mention of Aquinas brings up an important caveat to what I've just said, right? And I think you do want to elaborate on that, Ronen, and you said something like he's a weak realist or something along those lines.
Yeah, so Aquinas is actually kind of an interesting personality, because he is in the realist school of thought, but he's a modest or a moderate realist. He's not a complete realist. Now, George asked for a definition of realism versus idealism. Maybe I should just quickly give one. An idealist basically believes that knowledge is rooted in ideas, and that ideas are more important than physical reality. A realist believes that we must start with physical reality and derive knowledge from that, and that physical reality is real, and ideas come from our experience with physical reality. An idealist believes that ideas come first, and that ideas actually govern our understanding and in fact even are perhaps the basis for what we see in the physical world. So that's a very sort of brief and perhaps not a very exact definition of idealism and realism, but that's essentially what it is. So in terms of realism and idealism, Aquinas is a moderate realist because, like Aristotle, his logic is inductive. You know, he's a man of God, but he argues that we can come to know things by looking at things in experience. And we can come to understand the nature of reality by looking at the world that we are living in, the physical actual world. Now, one of the arguments that Plato makes is that the physical world can deceive us. Aquinas says no, the physical world doesn't deceive us because God would not allow the physical world to deceive us. You know, he is a man of God. So he would ask, why would God create a world that would deceive us? So he says, the world is not going to deceive us. The material world that we live in is not going to deceive us, but it can actually point us to things that are more real. For example, God. So, of course, Aquinas had his 6 proofs for the existence of God. So, by looking at particulars, says Aquinas, one can actually come in touch with ultimate reality. And that ultimate reality is non-corporeal. Okay, it's transcendent. It's the world of being in which God exists. So in that sense, Aquinas is an idealist. He's both an idealist and a realist because he says we start with experience, but experience takes us to transcendent realities.
Yeah. And Ronen, I could put it this way, right? That you know, he's a realist and he, you know, argues in that way, but at the same time, there's room for faith. And like his whole mission, if you want to put it that way, was to, in some sense, reconcile, you know, the faith and reason, almost in a way. That they come to the same conclusions.
It was considered somewhat questionable to logically prove the existence of God because it really brought into question the notion of faith. I mean, the idea was that you don't need logic to prove God. God is something that exists in the realm of faith. But Aquinas disagreed with that. He said there's no reason not to use logic to show that God exists.
Yeah,
because God gives us logic.
Yeah, this is his contribution, as it were. So, and now for something completely different, going to the opposite extreme. You know, from the point of view of the presentation, this is another example of the philosophical order. And Alla, I think it was you that sent me the link to that movie of Ayn Rand, you know, The Passion of Ayn Rand, it was called, which I enjoyed a lot, even though I have to say some of it was fairly close to home for me in some ways. Anyhow, in that movie, they show the scene of her standing on one foot with her hand behind, tied her back, etc., to explain her philosophy in words of one syllable. We'll go on to see what, you know, Ayn Rand thought about metaphysics and all that in just a moment. So slide 7 shows both Ayn Rand and a thing called the foot. So I thought that worked. That's a famous ink drawing. I don't know who it's by, but it's famous anyhow. Not famous enough. Before we go on, I should say, you know, Ayn Rand was from Russia, as everyone knows. I should say that one thing that I have certainly discovered in the last 3 years is that if you're going to do philosophy and if you're going to have a philosophy institute, etc., it's essential to have a strong and dynamic Russian-speaking woman in that mix. It's a sine qua non, as we might say in Latin.
Oh, John, that's a very interesting axiom, actually. I speak Russian and I founded the Aurora Philosophy Institute. So I may take it personally.
Well, Alla, it's intended to be taken personally. It was a thing called a compliment.
Okay, I will take it.
Yeah, good, excellent. So we'll move on to the, to the. This is according to the Atlas Society. Again, the meme is that Ayn Rand was once asked if she could present the basics of a philosophy, and it's in short form, standing on one foot. Here's what she said, and it's again this metaphysical order. So as far as Ayn Rand is concerned, metaphysics is definitely objective reality, not a supernatural being. Epistemology, she thinks, would follow. The epistemology that you should use is reason. The ethics is a thing called selfishness, which the Atlas Society actually softens to self-interest. But Ayn Rand did say selfishness. And the politics is a thing called laissez-faire capitalism. Now, the issue for me is this. I think I might agree that objective reality and reason are good in some sense. And also, I think I do agree, and ethics, and Ronen, I think, agrees with me too, that the ethics and the politics should follow from the epistemology. But here's the thing. Is it necessarily the case then that selfishness is a good look for realists? As for laissez-faire capitalism, which is a convoluted kind of construct, which does not, in fact, bear much or any relationship, to reality at all. I've spent my life, actually, 50 years of my life, trying to construct an alternative economic system to that. And I think that I've, finally succeeded in doing so with my forthcoming book, Beyond Barter. And I should just say, by the way, that for much of that time, I was indeed fortunate to have the help of another strong and dynamic Russian-speaking woman, who was not actually Russian, but Czech, the late Hanna Hermanska, who, needless to say, I miss very much. So anyhow, there's something of a disconnect here. What's the link, between the metaphysics, epistemology, and the ethics? And Ronen, what's your take on this?
Okay, well, Ayn Rand is again an interesting character. I remember when I was in second year university, I took a course where a political philosophy course where the professor was a big Ayn Rand sort of fanatic. I think you actually know the professor, John.
John Lidnoff.
That's right.
My colleague, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I took a course with him. Now, one of the things I found about Ayn Rand's ideas and the way that her followers kind of push her ideas, it's akin to religion. They proselytize you. They proselytize you. So I'm not sure that Ayn Rand is a great exemplar of a realist. However, having said that, I question this notion that Ayn Rand has access to objective reality in itself. I think she would argue that she does. And she would argue that she has access to reality by the use of logic and reason. Reason and logic gives us access to what is real. In fact, it's important to suppress emotions because emotions lead us astray. In fact, I've got a little quotation here from The Fountainhead, where one of her characters, Howard Rourke, those of you who have read The Fountainhead probably know it. He says, "Don't ask me about my family, my childhood, my friends, or my feelings. Ask me about the things I think." Okay? So thinking, reason, logic is the basis to objective reality. So to me, so I'm taking the side of idealism, I guess. So to me, it's ironic that Rand sort of emphasizes reason and logic as the basis for coming to know reality. Because in some ways, in many ways, that is a Platonic idea.
Okay.
The fact that she puts reason and logic above feelings is also very Platonic. Now, the world that she creates in objectivism, she claims is the real world, the world in itself. But I would suggest that in some ways it's an idealized world, not necessarily in a good way, because of, you know, the way that she props up selfishness and all of that. My point is that Rand thinks of herself and her philosophy as being hardcore realism, but what it seems to be really is a glorification of instrumental reason, which was at the heart of rampant capitalism with all its ensuing problems like alienation, inequality, poverty, asymmetrical distribution of resources, etc. I mean, maybe that is the way, maybe that is the legacy of realism.
I get it, actually. This, you know, what's missing is social ontology, right? There's no account of social ontology, which is what we're going to move on to, in the next set of slides. No, that's actually, we got a light bulb later on in the set of slides. I should have put it in here. Yeah, what's missing is social ontology. Anyway, the point is, what we did was we gave two objectives of this philosophical order. How metaphysics leads to epistemology, ethics, politics, and one example was the religious one. It's interesting you say that this is also a religion. Quite interesting. Alla, do you want to have the discussion now? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. This is like next.
So I'll stop sharing. Yeah.
Actually, you can share. I see people anyway. Doesn't matter for me.
That's better this way. It's better this way. I like to get the whole.
Okay, no problem. So, okay, we had this next section, and anyone who wants to participate, please raise your hands in the reaction section. Who is the first? Stella, please, you have some comments. Can you just say it?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, when you guys mentioned the movie, I enjoyed that movie a lot, and I think that it's like, since it was not a low budget film, but it was more of like a made for TV film from the 90s, it's kind of forgotten, much like Dorothy Parker and the Vicious Circle, or Mrs. Parker and the Vicious Circle, I think it's called. That's another one that's like about Dorothy Parker and stuff, that's also from like the 90s, that's kind of forgotten about. I just feel like there's this whole sort of like subgenre of like philosophical biopics from like the 90s that people don't watch as much anymore, and maybe they never did, but I really enjoyed that, and I can think of like 5 from that period that I really enjoyed. But when you guys mentioned that, anyone who's remotely interested in Ayn Rand, which I take it that if you're here you probably are, I just would recommend watching it. I've seen it like twice, and this is making me want to watch it again, so yeah.
Okay, nice comment, Stella, thank you a lot. And I see Steve Preston. Hi, Steve. You have a question or comment?
Hi. Question, comment together on Ayn Rand. Can you hear me?
I do.
Okay. Yes. When I was looking at like the list of the 4 things and thinking about their relationship, 2 things came to mind. One is, what is the metaphysics of Ayn Rand, and is it this sort of like objective reality, or is it self-interest? And then the other thought was, is it now really self-interest that is driving the whole thing, or in the case of Ayn Rand, is it self-interest that's driving the thing? And then metaphysics falls below that.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like, honestly, Steve, I know not that much about Ayn Rand. Okay, so like I gotta lay the cards on the table here. But
no problem. Dave actually in June gonna have a presentation, Ronen, about it.
oh, Dave.
Yeah, we're looking forward to that. But
Okay, well,
it's a future, yes.
is Dave? Are you here? Why don't you answer that question?
I don't know if he's ready, but anyway.
Okay. But no, but okay, so David, are you there?
Yeah.
No. Okay, so I'll try. I mean, I tend to agree with you, Steve. I don't know what her metaphysics is exactly. One of the things I did read while doing a bit of this is that she had a very she put reason on a pedestal, but she could be very emotional and extremely hard to live with and explosive. So she triumphed reason. She triumphed the idea that one can come to know reality through reason, but there seemed to be a lot of repression as well in the way that she lived her personal life. And I don't know about the notion of enlightened self-interest. I mean, there is something to it. I mean, economics is based on self-interest, and the idea that, you know, through self-interest you can actually, you know, create a benevolent society. Yeah, it's not that far-fetched. It does make sense. You know, those who produce companies, you know, they do it because they're wanting to become rich and, you know, have power. But at the same time, they do create a world where, you know, people get jobs and, you know, they have good lives because of their selfish, those, you know, people's selfish interests. So I don't know. She also, of course, came from a very totalitarian background. You know, her family was basically, her father apparently lost his business when during the Russian Revolution. So she was very much against those kinds of totalitarian systems where the individual is oppressed. Yeah.
So can I just come in? The metaphysics, Steve, is supposed to be, quote, objective reality, or existence exists. You know, that the physical reality is there, and that there is no kind of supernatural, transcendental, or no supernatural consciousness, for example, no God. So the reason I put it there was to directly compare with the previous one, you know, where the metaphysics was the existence of a supernatural deity. This is definitely rules out the existence of any kind of supernatural deity of that kind, and then builds up the metaphysics from there. My difficulty with it, and I actually do adhere to the proposal that the metaphysics, you know, implies the epistemology, and that the epistemology then implies the ethics. There is definitely a disconnect between when you get to the reason and then to the ethics. You see what I mean? You know, and to the politics. There's a huge disconnect there. You know, so I think that's right. Anyway, I think, you know, Randy has something to say. Thanks, Steve.
Randy, please unmute yourself. Randy, unmute.
I was trying. Yeah, Doctor, you alluded to this. The politics, laissez-faire, I would say, is an economic system, not a political one. And so if there is a political system that she was advocating, presumably it was freedom of some type of democracy, but where I'm going with it is, I'm curious as to the political system, and if the ethics is self-interest, would that also include the political system? So our politicians are definitely all self-interested.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, people like ourselves who are political economists don't make the sharp distinction that you do. you know, between the political system and the economic system. We're not really talking about, you know, politics in the sense of who counts the votes or, you know, what the debates in the House of Commons are like. We're talking about the general way in which the society is structured, the political economy, if you will, right?
Sure,
And
but doesn't self-interest as an ethics also include the political overlords?
Yes, I mean, obviously, what Ayn Rand is advocating is something like the American system, you know, which he takes as granted. You're now getting into political economics, which is another type of subject, which looks at, you know, the incentives that the different players in the political system have. You know, the politician and the bureaucrat is not a disinterested person at all. You know, the bureaucrat is attempting to maximize their own personal wealth. And what Ayn Rand would try to construct, whether she succeeds in it or not, is a, how can I put it, a system which would preclude that in some sense. As I say, I think the system which I've constructed would kind of do that job better, but that remains to be seen.
Okay, thank you, John. And Shishir, you can say.
Thank you very much, Alla. A wonderful discussion we're having today. John and Ronen, compliments to both of you. Really, realism and being a idealist, it's an interesting concept. And when you mention the fact that Aquinas was perhaps a little bit of both, I think most people are. Most people are. There is no necessarily boundaries that we say it's one or the other. But having said that, Ayn Rand, when you look at the circumstances she came from and her rebellion against the authoritarian regime that she escaped from, I can totally understand why she went in the other direction and like a pendulum swung to the other end, became a libertarian. Of course, there, there was absolutely no restrictions put on her freedom, personal liberty. As far as Aquinas was mentioned, here again is a story of how Aquinas gets influenced by the Arabs who had retained the Greek philosophy and the text. And he was obviously very much affected by it to the point where he says, beware of a man of a single book. Beware of a man of a single book. And here he is, a big proponent of Christianity, but still saying that there is room to be able to look at the other side of the equation. This really takes me to the, the Machiavellian thinking of how you kind of have to bend towards the needs of the society to try and become a fit for what is required of you, which is really what realism is all about. And this is why I find the Scottish Enlightenment has a lot to do with realism. It really maintains that. Way before Machiavellian, an Indian philosopher called Kautilya had written a book, very much so for the Gupta Empire, explaining how to remain in power. Machiavellian indeed. In fact, if you know about Machiavellian, that really was his job resume, the prince, to get out of prison. He was trying to please the family so he could be released. But that brings me to the discussion I had with this group about Upanishads. And when I mentioned Upanishads, there was of course, discussion about the Bhagavad Gita, which is an epic story about kingdoms which are fighting with each other, and yet they're cousins. And here is the hero of the story, throws his bows and arrows down and says to Krishna, and he says, why am I fighting my kin? There's something very wrong with the concept. And at that point, he says, do you, as a god, do you not tell me that killing is wrong? And then the advice he gets is, yes, that's the idealist side. But you have to exist in this world. And for that reason, I want you to pick up that bow and arrow and go to fight and kill your cousin because he is in the wrong. Ethically, he's doing the wrong thing. So you need to punish him for it. So really, it shows both sides of the equation. And that, I think, is really what we all humans are. A little bit of both.
Shishir, may I ask you a question, please?
Please.
which you brought it up. You remember when you were in hospital at that time?
Yeah.
Right, and I gave your presentation like in your stead, if you remember, and then it had to do with the Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita and so on and so forth. And I made the point in there that you know, I thought that there was a lot of connection between Hinduism, Buddhism, etc. That there's definitely an element of idealism in that sense, as you just recounted. And there were great parallels, for example, with German idealism. You know, there's that, you know, when, what's the guy's name? Schopenhauer first came across so-called Eastern philosophy, right? He was amazed at how similar it was to his own opinions. And I think you and I have had this discussion before also, that, how can I put it, that there's a lot similar to Plato as well. If you you know, look at Hinduism and Buddhism, and at the end of that talk, and we've actually put that talk on the not on the YouTube channel, it's in research there, and at the end I said, I think that's right. I think there's a lot of parallels between the idealist strand in Western thought and, if you like, the idealist strand in Eastern thought, and I made the point, you know, obviously there's a common Indo-European origin, you know, to those things. But the point I made was that there does not seem to be anything comparable to Aristotle in the Hindu and Buddhist tradition. There doesn't seem to be an Aristotle figure. And I said that I was going to ask you that question, consult you on that question. I'm doing that right now.
Wonderful, great question. The beauty of being able to see both sides of the equation, I think, really brings us back to the two big texts in Hinduism.
Yeah.
Buddhism, of course, is a religion without God.
Yeah.
Whereas in Hinduism, there's plenty of gods to choose from, depends on which angle you're looking from. But if you look at it from the context of how do we kind of relate one to the other, there is one text called the Ramayana. Ramayana is a story about an idealist king who does everything to make sure that he does not break any ethical rules. But by being that, he's constantly stepping on his own toes. For instance, the society says his wife had been kidnapped. Now this wife can no longer be your wife because she's not pure anymore. This is idealism carried too far. Then you read the other big text, which is the Mahabharata, which talks about the God himself who has to join the weaker side in a battle. And the advice that the God gives him is, no, pick up the arms, kill them, because they deserve to die. And he says, yeah, but you told us that, you know, these are things you'd never do. Killing is not right. And the God says, no, this time around, it is right, because ethically, it is the right thing. So there's the Aristotle side of the Plato.
Yeah. Good. Thank you, Shasir. It's
Okay.
yeah, been meaning to do that for a long time, actually.
Wow,
Okay.
that's really
Thank you.
interesting. Mhm.
Okay, so I think we can go to this next section, if you don't mind. Yes, John?
Yeah, let's do that.
So the section 3, and it's the realist turn and the critic of knowledge. Go ahead, John. Oh, you can share the screen, yes.
I'm trying to. Yeah, there we are.